All right, deep divers, ready to dive into .NET Aspire deployment.
Sounds good.
Today we're zeroing in on Docker Compose and why it's such a game changer. Whether you're prepping for a new project
Oh, yeah.
or just curious about cloud-native apps, this one's for you. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's clarify what .NET Aspire actually is. Think of it as this heavy-duty framework
hmm
for building those cloud-ready applications, especially those slick microservices-based ones.
It's not just any framework, though. .NET Aspire is really interesting because of its opinionated stack. Like having a curated toolbox and
Ah,
blueprints designed to get your app production really fast.
opinionated stack, I like that. But hold on, wouldn't that kind of limit your choices? What if I want to use a different database or a specific tool that I like?
That's a great question. .NET Aspire is actually super flexible. Remember how we said it's cloud agnostic?
Right, right.
So it's not tied to any specific cloud provider. So while it kind of guides you towards best practices, you've still got the freedom to swap out components and tailor that stack to your needs.
So it's like having a guide, not a dictator.
Exactly.
I like that.
It's like a seasoned chef sharing their favorite recipes, but they're also encouraging you to experiment.
Makes sense. So how does this whole opinionated stack thing actually affect deployment? I mean, isn't deployment just hitting publish and hoping for the best?
Well, with .NET Aspire, deployment is a bit more, it's more nuanced. And honestly, it's a lot smarter. It uses what are called NuGet packages to handle all the heavy lifting. These packages are like pre-built modules for everything from orchestrating your services to integrating with databases like Redis or PostgreSQL.
So instead of deploying your whole application as this massive thing, you're breaking it down into these smaller, manageable packages.
Exactly. Imagine building a house, right? With traditional methods, it's like moving the entire house in one go.
Oh, wow.
But with .NET Aspire's NuGet package approach, it's more like assembling a house from pre-made walls, floors, and roof sections.
Ah, that's how this whole cloud-native microservices thing comes in. You can deploy and update individual parts without taking the entire application down.
You got it. And since .NET Aspire is cloud agnostic, you can deploy these packages on pretty much any platform that supports .NET and containers, like Azure Container Apps or Kubernetes.
Wow, that's with a lot of flexibility. Wouldn't managing all these pieces across platforms be a nightmare?
That's where Docker Compose comes in. It's like the maestro of containers, letting you define and manage all your services in one neat little file. It's like an orchestra conductor, right?
Okay.
Making sure each musician, in this case, each container is playing in perfect harmony.
I'm starting to see the appeal here, but isn't Docker Compose mostly for local development or smaller projects?
That's a common misconception. Docker Compose is fantastic for those, yeah? But it's also incredibly powerful for managing deployments outside of big cloud environments. It gives you, that hands-on control,
I see, yeah.
which can be invaluable for some projects.
So if our listener is thinking, Docker Compose sounds great, but I don't want to write those files by hand, what's the solution?
Enter Asper8. This command line tool is like your Docker Compose wizard,
A wizard.
specifically designed for generating those files directly from your .NET Aspire project.
Aspirate a wizard. I like it. Walk me through how this magic works.
It's surprisingly straightforward. First, navigate to the app host directory of your .NET Aspire project. Think of that directory as like the control center, where all the deployment magic happens.
Okay, the app host directory, got it. And then,
Then you simply use the command, aspirate generate output format compose. Aspirate does its thing, analyzes your project,
nice.
and churns out those Docker Compose files. All ready to go. You'll find them all neatly organized in the app host Aspire output directory.
So Aspirate takes care of all those configuration details for me.
Exactly. It removes a lot of that manual work and the potential for errors, too. But there is one crucial thing we need to talk about: secret handling.
Okay.
By default, Aspirate's Docker Compose generation actually disables secret support.
Wait, why would it do that? Isn't that like a security risk?
It's a deliberate security measure. You see, secrets like database connection strings or API keys, those are incredibly sensitive. We don't want them exposed in the Docker Compose files.
That makes sense. So how do we handle these secrets securely if they're not in the Docker Compose files?
There are a few options. You can manage them manually, maybe using environment variables, or you can use dedicated secret management tools like Azure Key Vault.
We'll dive deeper into those later, I'm sure.
Yep.
Okay, good to know. Sounds like security is a top priority with .NET Aspire deployments. So we've covered the basics of .NET Aspire, its opinionated stack, the role of NuGet packages, and how Docker Compose, along with Aspirate, can really streamline that whole deployment process. Where do we go from here?
Now that we've got the groundwork laid, let's shift gears a bit and explore how these concepts actually play out in real-world situations. Imagine you're building an e-commerce platform using .NET Aspire, of course.
Okay, e-commerce, I'm picturing those slick product pages and virtual shopping carts. So where do we start with .NET Aspire?
With .NET Aspire's microservices approach, you could break that platform down into smaller, more manageable services. You might have one service for the product catalog,
Okay.
another for managing those shopping carts, and another for processing orders.
So it's like instead of one giant application, we have a team of many applications, each doing their own thing.
Exactly. And that's where Docker Compose really shines. You'd use Aspirate to generate that Docker Compose file that defines each of these microservices as separate containers, all organized and ready to work together.
So like a container for the product catalog, one for shopping carts and so on, all orchestrated by Docker Compose.
Precisely. The Docker Compose file also specifies how those containers are all networked, making sure they can communicate with each other seamlessly. So for example, when a user adds something to their cart, the shopping cart container can easily talk to the product catalog container to get product details and update inventory.
Like a choreographed dance, each container playing its part. So is this how we get that scalability and resilience we hear so much about with cloud-native applications? I mean,
Absolutely. Each microservice can be scaled independently, and if one has an issue, it won't bring the whole platform down.
gotcha. That makes sense. Now, let's say our listener's working on something different, like a data processing pipeline. How would .NET Aspire and Docker Compose handle that?
Good question. Let's say you're collecting data from different sources, cleaning it, transforming it, and then loading it all into a data warehouse. With .NET Aspire, you could have one microservice for fetching the raw data,
Uh-huh.
another for data transformation, and another for loading it into that warehouse.
So like instead of a virtual shopping cart, we've got this data pipeline flowing through these containers.
You got it. Docker Compose makes sure the data flows smoothly between them, just like products moving through a well-run supply chain.
This modular approach is really powerful, but what about deploying to the cloud, like Azure? Would we still use Docker Compose there?
Docker Compose is great for local development and even some production stuff, but with cloud deployments, especially on platforms like Azure, you've got even more options.
Ooh, like what?
Well, one option is Azure Container Apps. It's a fully managed serverless platform made for running containerized apps.
Serverless, meaning no managing servers. I'm listening.
Exactly. Azure Container Apps handles all those infrastructure headaches, so you can focus on building and deploying your app.
.NET Aspire works well with Azure Container Apps, right?
They're a perfect match. .NET Aspire makes it super easy to deploy and scale your microservices on Azure Container Apps. And if you need even more power and control, there's always Kubernetes.
Kubernetes, the container orchestration giant.
Right. Kubernetes is like the ultimate conductor for containerized applications, especially at large scale. It handles those complex deployments, manages resources really efficiently, and even takes care of self-healing, making sure your application stays up and running.
So for our listener who's thinking, Kubernetes sounds powerful but also super complicated, is there any way to make it easier with .NET Aspire?
Remember our friend Aspirate, the Docker Compose wizard?
Yeah?
Well, it can also generate Kubernetes manifests, which are basically blueprints for deploying on Kubernetes. It's like Aspirate is translating your .NET Aspire project into instructions Kubernetes can understand.
So no matter what deployment path our listener picks, Docker Compose, Azure Container Apps, or Kubernetes, .NET Aspire has got them covered.
You got it. It's all about using the right tool for the job. And .NET Aspire gives you that flexibility to adapt to different environments. But no matter what platform you choose, never forget about security, especially when it comes to those sensitive secrets.
Right, security is key. Can't just leave database passwords and API keys lying around. What are some best practices for handling secrets securely with .NET Aspire deployments?
One common method is using environment variables to store those secrets instead of hard-coding them into your application.
The environment variables are like little secret compartments.
That's a good way to think about it. And when you're managing these environment variables, especially across different environments like development, staging, and production, you'll want to use a tool like Azure Key Vault.
Azure Key Vault, that sounds interesting.
It acts like a super secure digital vault, specifically for storing and managing secrets. It's got centralized access control, encryption, even audit logging. It makes sure your secrets are handled carefully.
Like a bank-grade security system. But how does it work with .NET Aspire?
.NET Aspire integrates really smoothly with Azure Key Vault, making it easy to retrieve and inject those secrets into your application at runtime, and you don't even need to write complex code for it. .NET Aspire has built-in support.
Wow, so it's like a secure pipeline delivering secrets straight to my application.
You got it. It simplifies things and ensures security is built into every step.
I'm really impressed with the thought put into .NET Aspire. It's not just about building apps, it's about building them securely and deploying them confidently. But before we get too lost in the technical details, I want to bring it back to our listener for a sec.
Yeah, good idea.
So, dear listener, if all this talk about containers, orchestrators, and secret vaults has got your head spinning, don't worry.
It's a lot to take in.
We've covered a lot. The main point here is that .NET Aspire gives you this robust and flexible framework for building and deploying cloud-native applications. And tools like Docker Compose, Azure Container Apps, Kubernetes, they're all here to help you on that journey.
And remember, security is not optional. Treat those secrets like precious gems and use tools like Azure Key Vault to keep them safe.
Well said. But before we wrap up, I do want to leave our listener with something to think about.
Okay, what is it?
We've talked a lot about Docker Compose, Azure Container Apps, and Kubernetes, but the cloud world's always changing. What about serverless platforms like AWS Lambda or Google Cloud Functions?
Ah, yes. Serverless is really taking off.
It is.
And for good reason.
So here's the question for our listener. How could we use .NET Aspire to build and deploy apps to these serverless platforms?
That's a great question. It would take some creative thinking, maybe some new tools, but it could open up so many more possibilities.
It really could. Imagine combining .NET Aspire's structured approach with the agility and flexibility of serverless.
Yeah.
Definitely a lot to explore there. But for now, we'll leave that as a challenge for our listener. In the meantime, go dive into the world of .NET Aspire deployment. Play around with different tools and techniques. Don't be afraid to share what you discover with the community.
Exactly. Collaboration and knowledge sharing are so important.
Couldn't agree more. Welcome back, Deep Divers. We're wrapping up our .NET Aspire deployment journey today. And I gotta say, I feel like we've unearthed some real gems of knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. Always more to learn. But I think we've given our listeners some solid tools for navigating this whole .NET Aspire deployment world.
For sure. Before we resurface, though, let's go back to those aha moments we promised at the start. Remember how we talked about .NET Aspire being more than just a framework?
Right. It's a whole ecosystem, really, designed for streamlining that process of building and deploying production-ready cloud-native apps.
Exactly. One of the biggest takeaways here is how deployment works. It's not about just chucking code onto a server and cross off your fingers.
And nope.
It's about carefully orchestrating every piece, using those NuGet packages we talked about.
Yeah, and that's where Docker Compose really steps in, especially when you need that extra control and flexibility, like for local development or smaller projects.
Right, and of course we can't forget Aspirate, our Docker Compose wizard taking away all that manual file writing pain.
Such a time saver. But even with these awesome tools, we can't ignore security, especially when it comes to sensitive info, like database logins or API keys.
You're so right. Security is absolutely essential. So listener, if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this, no worries.
Totally normal.
It's a lot to take in, especially with a new technology.
The key is to break it down into bite-sized pieces. Try Aspirate, experiment with Docker Compose, see how it all fits together.
Exactly. And remember, the .NET Aspire community is super welcoming and helpful. Don't be afraid to ask questions. There's so much knowledge and experience out there to share.
Oh yeah, for sure. Collaboration and knowledge sharing are at the heart of it all.
I love that. Okay, as we come to the end of our deep dive, I want to leave you with that final thought-provoking question. We spent a lot of time on Docker Compose, Azure Container Apps, Kubernetes, but the cloud landscape is always evolving, right?
It is always something new on the horizon.
Exactly. What about those serverless platforms? AWS Lambda, Google Cloud Functions, those kinds of things?
Ah, serverless, yeah, it's really gaining momentum, and for good reason.
Right. So what are your thoughts on that? How could we use .NET Aspire with those serverless platforms?
That is a fantastic question. Serverless architectures offer so much scalability and cost-effectiveness. Figuring out how .NET Aspire could fit in there, that would be a really exciting challenge.
It would. Imagine the possibilities. Combining .NET Aspire's structured approach with the agility of serverless.
It'd be pretty amazing.
A lot of room for innovation there. I have no doubt the .NET Aspire community will find some creative solutions.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, dear listener, that brings us to the end of our journey today. We hope you found this .NET Aspire deployment deep dive insightful.
We had a great time.
Remember, this isn't the end of your learning journey. Keep exploring, keep experimenting, push the boundaries of what's possible with .NET Aspire.
Absolutely.
And most importantly, have fun. Until next time, happy coding and happy deploying.
See you on the next deep dive.